Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. Big news out of Meta announcing some sweeping changes to how they handle content, essentially a pledge to crack down on the censorship that we now know has been unfolding on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and others. What did you make of this announcement?
Well, it seems like we're coming to the end of an era here as the Biden administration comes to a close. The Biden administration, and even a little bit before that, was a period marked by heavy handed governmental efforts to censor content on social media and social media companies being very compliant with the government when it pressured them to censor people on various topics. First with suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop story, and then immediately after Joe Biden took office, pressuring the Facebook and the other social media companies to censor content that went against the government's narrative on COVID, among other efforts. And with Elon Musk's purchase of X, of course, we saw a big change at Twitter where free speech is now the norm instead of heavy censorship. We saw exposure of that censorship through Musk's release of the Twitter files and other things that have come out in litigation against the social media companies. And now I think that the whole era of censorship is coming to an end. I think there's market pressure coming from X, where people are flocking so that they can speak freely without having to worry about having their posts deleted or their account suspended or being banned completely for saying the wrong thing. I think he wants people to come back to Facebook who have flocked over there. And I think he also probably realizes that that government pressure to censor is going to go away. It abated somewhat over the course of the Biden years. And now President Trump has a very different attitude toward freedom of speech online. And so everybody's starting a new era, it seems like. And of course, the Supreme Court this Friday will consider whether the Biden ban on TikTok will stand. President Trump is arguing that it should be delayed until he takes office so that he can work something out so it isn't banned. And if that happens, that would really close the book on this whole period of Biden administration censorship that we've had and make these social media platforms the public square, the forum for free speech that I think most people want them to be.
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack, and I want to talk more about TikTok since that is coming up. Why do you think Zuckerberg and others were seemingly so willing to go along with the government narrative, right? To punish people for asking questions sometimes, it seemed. And of course, there are lots of different posts and lots of different circumstances under which people were punished. But why do you think this sudden change of heart? And you mentioned the market pressure, but my concern is more, why were they so willing to do it in the first place?
Right. So I think there was certainly government pressure where they were privately and publicly telling Facebook and other platforms, you had better do what we say especially with respect to COVID. And I think probably early on, some people within these platforms actually were thinking, well, I want to do the right thing. I don't want to contribute to the spread of a virus and all that. And there was probably some good intentions on the behalf of some people at these platforms at the beginning. I think when it comes to the ongoing censorship later in the COVID era and the political censorship, you probably have a lot of people working within these companies who share the less political agenda and were willing to help advance that in their minds by censoring speech that they don't like. I think there are plenty of willing accomplices in these organizations. Of course, we've also seen through the Twitter files that there were people with what we might call deep state connections there as well, that were perhaps doing the bidding of people within government other than the president. So there was government influence and pressure combined with, I think, the natural tendency of some employees of these companies to censor ideas that they don't like. All coming together to result in a very oppressive environment for a number of years there. And of course, we saw an oppressive environment across many facets of society early in the COVID era, and this is just one of them. And now that's seems like a rather distant memory to a lot of people. And the demand for free speech has been shown both in the market and in the election, where people voted for the candidate who presented himself as the free speech candidate. And so I think that primarily is what accounts for the change.
Well, and what you just said there is very important, because when you go and you watch Zuckerberg talking about this, right, you can read the release, but when you watch the video, it's about a 5-minute video of him explaining these changes. He talks about the cautions, like, hey, we're going to miss some things. There are going to be some things that now stay up, that you might not like, but they feel like this is the right way to go. He makes it very clear at one point. He says the election, and I guess I'll paraphrase it, was a tipping point that showed that free speech needed to be respected more, essentially. And I thought that was a very interesting admission from him. Not a lot of people would openly say that if they feel like they've made mistakes in how they've handled censorship. When you saw that part of it or heard that part of it, where he actually said the election was tied essentially to this decision, what were you thinking?
Well, I mean, one thing that occurs to me is it makes sense for someone like him in a big business that could face threats of regulation from either party. I mean, they have faced threats at the federal level from Democrats lately, state level from Republicans, to try to get along with whoever's in power. And the way to get along with the Democrats when Biden took office was to do censorship. And the way to get along now, it seems, is to have more open communication. So is this a change of heart? Is this more like just reading the room and the political climate and doing what's going to be best for Facebook? Oh, I don't know the man, so I can't say for sure. But I can say that it's going to be hard to trust Zuckerberg on this anytime soon, as someone who was involved in suing Facebook over censorship and seeing how they fought tooth and nail to defend what they did, and they mass censored people, banned people from these platforms, and then refused to be held accountable in court. And now, only much later, after some people were seriously harmed by not being able to get their message out or conduct their business online anymore in the major platforms, now they come back and say they've had a change of heart. Well, that's great. And, if it continues, then maybe someday we could have some trust there. Till then, it's hard to trust, but we can appreciate it as far as it goes for now.
So for those who don't know, for the Liberty Justice Center, the work that you do, how successful have lawsuits been when it comes to people challenging being banned or being punished or being censored, in terms of the way the legal system looks at, and I know this is a big question, but looks at social media platforms?
Well, unfortunately, lawsuits against the big platforms and the government were not very successful, because you would have people who could point out that the censorship was going on, that the government was pressuring them to do this censorship, was even holding trainings to tell them what to censor and so forth. But the courts would say, as they said in our case on behalf of Justin Hart, a social media influencer, well, yeah, you've shown that this goes on, but you don't have any evidence that they specifically singled out your client for censorship, and therefore you can't make the connection you would need to make for him to have a claim. And then another case on this went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they said a similar thing about past censorship, where the direct evidence of you censor these people wasn't there. And the Supreme Court then also said, well, now it looks like, they're backing off the COVID-related censorship, so you can't show a threat in the future, so there's nothing we can do for you now. It would be unconstitutional for the government to pressure them to censor you, but we're not actually going to do anything about that now because of the lack of evidence of past and future harm, even though we know this is going on all over the place. And that's very frustrating to somebody in our business, where we are trying to protect people's free speech rights against really unprecedented threats and open threats and censorship by the federal government. So it's fortunate that this change is happening nonetheless.
Well, and those lawsuits, and I don't know how you feel about this, but whether or not they're successful, the fact that they're brought and they receive so much attention, even if Facebook or Twitter or whoever it is wins, or X now, at the end of the day, that negative attention and pressure, I still think does make an impact on those companies, perhaps, and might even be one of the things that help move this along, where it's like, we don't want to be dealing with this anymore. Whether or not we can legally do it is a different question as to whether or not we should do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And, in the public interest litigation business, that's a big part of our thinking that, well, even if we don't win every time, which we won't, we can bring attention to these things that will create pressure for change, regardless of what the courts do in the end.
Okay, so let's talk before we go about TikTok. This is a big case, obviously. And again, this is one I think a lot of people don't know a lot about it. They've heard of dangers of TikTok being owned by a company in China, the Chinese government potentially having access, fears over what that means. And then obviously proposals in the US, which this is not a new issue. It's been going on for a few years now, to try and ban TikTok in the US or somehow force the sale. Take us through the case and what you're hoping to see happen.
So back in April, President Biden signed a law that effectively bans TikTok. It says that essentially if TikTok is going to be offered in the US, then the company providing it in the US has to be completely separate from from communist China and from any other foreign adversary. The parent of TikTok, ByteDance, which has its offices in Beijing, has to divest itself of US TikTok. And that has to be totally separate and independent, not use their algorithm or anything. And that TikTok has said that as a practical matter, that's just not feasible. There was a 270-day deadline, which happens to end on January 19th, the day before President Trump takes office, for that to happen. And TikTok has said, that's not feasible. We couldn't do it that fast, and we can't really do it at all because TikTok is a global platform. And what makes it so special and useful to people is this content recommendation engine that's based in China and updated there. And if you sever the platform from that, it's just not TikTok anymore. It's something else. And so it amounts to a ban. And then what the law also gives the president the authority in the future to say that any other social media platform that's large is controlled by a foreign adversary and a threat to national security, and to unilaterally ban that platform. So we were very disturbed by this law, because whatever you think of TikTok, and as much as we may detest the Chinese government, it's disturbing for the government to shut down a platform that millions of Americans use to speak to other Americans, and also to give the president this power to take down other social media sites based on allegations of connections to foreign governments. And, we've seen in the second half of 2024, after this law passed, suddenly you see stories about, Elon Musk is taking his marching orders from Putin somehow. And, is there much doubt that this was setting the stage to potentially declare X to be controlled by a foreign adversary and take it down? So this law is very disturbing to us. And we challenged it on behalf of a group called Based Politics, which is a right-leaning organization that uses TikTok and other social media platforms to advance ideas related to individual liberty and free markets and reach an audience of young people. And they've been especially successful on TikTok because it does connect them to the Gen Z audience they want in a way that other platforms don't, because TikTok somehow figures out who would actually watch these videos and puts them in front of them. And those people wouldn't necessarily seek that content out on other platforms. So if this is shut down, they will not be able to reach that unique audience anymore, and their speech rights will suffer. So we challenged it on that basis, on their behalf. TikTok also brought a lawsuit challenging it. So did some other TikTok creators. And the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit heard that case and upheld the ban, actually, in a decision entered in early December. It said, well, the government has said we need to do this for national security, and that's basically good enough. And so we quickly asked the Supreme Court to hear the case, and it is going to hear the case on this Friday, January 10th. And we argue there that the government's national security argument cannot justify this sweeping ban on speech. One problem with this is the people who passed this ban said that one reason they were doing it was because they don't like some of the things that people are saying on TikTok. You had Mitt Romney, for example, saying that one reason it passed is because of the number of mentions of Palestinians on TikTok. Well, whatever you think about Israel and Palestine, that is not a legitimate basis for the government to shut down a social media platform. And then the government even now justifies it by saying, well, maybe in the future, the Chinese government will lean on TikTok and tell it to promote this and suppress that. And maybe later they'll ask it to turn over some of Americans' data. And those might be legitimate concerns, but under the First Amendment, you cannot shut down people's speech, even for national security reasons, without an imminent threat. And that just doesn't exist here. And really, this whole thing is of a piece with this censorship of speech online that we've been seeing for the past 4 years. And we're hopeful that the Supreme Court will help bring that era to an end by shutting this down. And President Trump has said that he is going to figure out how to address the national security concerns while respecting free speech. And so we're hopeful that he'll do that.
That was going to be my final question for you. You know, looking at this, obviously, the people who are concerned about how China might use the data, looking at, all these different claims about what they're trying to do with TikTok and all of that, whether it's true or not, is there a feasible way, in your view, to find that balance between national security and obviously maintaining First Amendment freedoms of Americans who are willingly using this app? I think every household probably has somebody in it using the app at some point. Can you find that balance?
Yeah, I think so. And on the data privacy side, people choose to use apps all the time that suck up their data about where they're going and what else they're looking at and what they click on and how long they look at things. And, I think people can make a choice as to who they want to share their data with and who they don't. And if they think that potentially China could do something with their data that would be bad, then they can choose not to install it on their phone. And if the federal government thinks that it's a national security threat for that reason, it could ban its employees from having the app on their phones. Now, it's interesting, after this ban passed, Kamala Harris then opened up a TikTok account. So you would think if these people thought that there was a real threat to national security here, they wouldn't be opening up TikTok accounts, even, well, maybe it is your campaign person and not you, but even so, if that's really true, why would you want it anywhere near you? And yet they don't
represent you, right? I mean, you're representing, you're attaching yourself to it by having it as a campaign, page. I mean,
it's hard to take them seriously on that. Also, when this targets speech platforms where people can express political ideas, but it exempts everything else. Like you can have Chinese associated apps where people can share content if it's limited to business, product, and travel reviews and information. Well, that could spy on you just the same. Why are we exempting those? Well, I think they're exempting those because it's not really about the data privacy. It's really about they don't like what people are saying on TikTok. And when it comes to China potentially manipulating the content, well, people are allowed to look at whatever mix of content they want to look at. And one suggestion that our side puts forward in this case, I don't think it's necessary, but it'd be better than a ban, would be, okay, you put up a warning when people sign on to TikTok that says, this is potentially manipulated by the Chinese government. So, be aware of that and take it with a grain of salt or something like that, as opposed to you can't communicate on this platform at all anymore. And the government, when it justifies a restriction on speech, it's supposed to come over with some kind of evidence and show that it considered alternatives that wouldn't restrict people's speech as much. And there's no evidence that they really did that seriously at all here. They just kind of say, no, other things wouldn't work, but there's no real evidence of that. There's no rigorous analysis of that. So President Trump is confident that if he goes back to the drawing board, he can do this in a way that respects free speech. He's actually asked the court to hold off on ruling and just delay the law, and he'll come and do his thing, and then maybe the court doesn't have to decide it at all. We don't think that's necessary. It's just unconstitutional. You can strike it down, and then President Trump can do his thing. But regardless, these national security justifications, whatever merit there may be to them, don't justify this kind of immediate sweeping ban on all kinds of speech that has absolutely nothing to do with China.
Well, I so appreciate you breaking that down. That is going to be a big case to watch. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.